Hi, my name's Tim Alcock of Qualimetric Limited. Over the last few months we've had quite a few inquiries regarding the application of a couple of ISO standards, namely ISO 15189, which applies to clinical laboratories, and ISO 22870, which particularly applies to point of care services. I've put this video together to try and give an overview of these two standards and give people an idea about what their content is and how they might be applied. So we're going to cover today a few topics. One is a bit about quality standards that apply and some of the principles behind quality and quality assurance. And secondly, I'm going to give a quick overview of the content of 15189. And then we'll have a look at some of the additional requirements that apply to point of care, which is ISO 22870, which kind of sit on top of the requirements of 15189. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about accreditation, particularly in the UK, about how you might obtain UCAS accreditation. So I hope you find this session of use, and let's get started. Firstly, I'd like to talk about a few different quality standards that might apply that you might have heard of. The first one is ISO 9001, and that gives requirements for any type of quality management system for any type of organisation. So this standard originally was applied in manufacturing and assembly. Now it can apply to any type of industry, whether it be manufacturing, assembly, banks, hotels, care homes, any type of organisation. So it's quite generic and it has to apply to a lot of different types of companies. And as it says here, this specifies quality management system requirements for when an organisation needs to sort of demonstrate that it can provide quality services and also to kind of improve its operation over time by enhancing customer satisfaction and its own internal processes. So this can apply to any type of organisation type or size, and is designed to be quite generic in that way. In terms of laboratories, there is a standard which is used called ISO IEC 17025, and that applies to testing and calibration laboratories. So laboratories who perform testing of all types of products, from toys to tyres to chemicals to tea, forensics, all types of laboratories like that would apply 17025. It also applies to calibration laboratories who calibrate equipment, for example, balances or thermocouples, to demonstrate assurance that the results of the instrument are correct. In terms of medical laboratories or clinical labs, in the past in the UK, the CPA provided this service, but more recently this has now been taken over by UCAS, and the standard that's now applied is called 15189. Now 15189 is a kind of derivative of 17025. Unfortunately, it's based upon the previous version of ISO 17025 and will be updated at some point. But this applies to clinical laboratories specifically. So NHS labs, these kind of things would use 15189 as being their quality assurance basis standard. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit today about ISO 22870, which is for point of care testing. And this sits on top of 15189, so it kind of is paired up with it. You can only use 22870 with 15189. You can't use it in conjunction with ISO 17025. But it sits on top of ISO 15189 and gives additional requirements that need to be met. And I'll be talking about the content of these last two standards as we go through the session. In this session, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the principles that sit behind the concepts of quality and quality assurance on which these standards are based. There is a standard called ISO 9000, which is an introduction to the ISO 9000 series of standards, and it covers some terminology and a bit of introduction to the standards. It doesn't contain a glossary of terms which talks about some definitions, one of which is the definition of quality, which is stated here. And that's defined as the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics of an object fulfills requirements. Probably not that helpful. However, we do have a few other definitions we could use. One, coined by a chap called Philip Crosby in the USA, talked about quality being conformance to requirements. In other words, that if we follow the requirements, assuming the requirements are correct and meet the customer needs, of course, and we follow those and then seek to improve them over time, meeting customer needs, then that would be a good thing. Perhaps a bit more of a general definition would be one coined by a guy called Joseph Duran, another US consultant, who talks about quality being fitness for purpose or fitness for use. But I think all of these focus really on meeting the needs of the customer and their expectations. So let's have a look at those. Now, if we're looking at a laboratory situation, obviously the customers or users of the service, whether that be a patient or a clinic or a research organisation want to have confidence in the services they're being provided, to be assured that the correct results are being provided, which is the third bullet here. Of course, we need to make sure we've got competent personnel who are doing the collection and the performance of the work and testing and everything else. We may also be interested in the reports being clear. So when we use the reports, they're clear to interpret and the data's presented in a way which is in the right format and clear for the user. Also value for money, of course, that we want to make more with less. On time is a massive feature. We want our results on time and shorter lead times. We want quality of care of the patient. Also, to be kept informed about the results if the things are delayed or whatever. And also, we have concerns about confidentiality, impartiality, and other aspects like this. So all of these things are considerations that the end user, or whether it's the patient, say, or a clinic or a research organisation, would be interested in ensuring, and many more things too. So for me, that's really the starting point of all this: is what do the customers need and expect. And that's not just today, that things move on. We have new diseases, we have new viruses, we have new test kits, so we need to keep up to date and move forward as time goes on. With that in mind, the starting point, as I say, would be the customer. So on the right hand side here we have a customer who has some needs and expectations, which we mentioned just now, and we have on the other side the customer who's requesting, it may or may not be the same person, who's requesting the analysis to be done. Now, if we look at the blue line in the centre, the core business process, normally it fits a similar pattern with lots of different types of laboratory. So we might start off perhaps in the government sector. We may well have a service level agreement which defines the scope of services and sort of portfolio of work to be done. In a commercial world, this would normally be a contract or an outline agreement or even a purchase order. And then from that, we would then have some sort of request to perform the analysis. And then after that, we might collect the sample, so that could be done at the patient's side, a collection person, perhaps swabbing or phlebotomy. And then after that, we then receive the sample in the laboratory, if we're going to subsequently analyse it, and then perform the analysis and then report the results. So that's basically the sort of core business process, if you like. And all of those steps, of course, are important. If the service level agreement is misleading, or the request is not clear, or the sample's not collected properly, or it's contaminated, or it's not stored properly, or received properly, or booked in properly, or analysed properly, all of those things could affect the end result. Now, it doesn't stop there. We also have some support processes which enable the core process to operate properly. Clearly, we need staff to be recruited and trained to be able to do the analysis, the sample collection, whatever. So you might have some HR department or personnel department or training thing, but whatever. We need to make sure that we train up people properly, such as they're competent to perform the work, and maintain those competencies over time. We also rely on IT. I think nobody can live now without some kind of IT, whether that's email or something more sophisticated like laboratory information management systems, LIMS systems, or even just data collection servers, that kind of thing. So we need software to support the operation of the laboratory as well. We also need reagents, consumables, gases, swabs, packaging materials, things like that. So we need to buy stuff. So we need to look after the purchasing process, and when we receive the goods, to make sure that they're stored properly in proper conditions and within their shelf life and aspects like that. We also perhaps need equipment to make measurements, and so balances and pipettes and temperature monitoring devices. So they require some maintenance or possibly calibration to do the work. So we need to have some kind of calibration process, and perhaps facilities to make sure the facilities are clean and swabbed and all the rest of it, and the services provided. So all these things are important to support the core business. I've not mentioned all of them here, but you get the idea. So when we look at 15189, we'll see it's not just the core business aspects that are covered, but it also covers the supporting elements which support the operation of the lab, because clearly they're critical. Finally, I want to talk about management. So management has a role to play here, clearly. So management will be looking at the overall strategy and policy and mission, if you like, of the organisation, setting objectives, perhaps KPIs, also looking at making sure that we've got the resources, hopefully, and the organisation structure, and people are clear about what their duties and responsibilities are, and also to sort of monitor the performance and review the performance of the laboratory operation and look at improvement over time. So management also has a large role to play. And again, 15189 talks about the management and the clinical oversight of the laboratory as well. Not just to meet the customer needs today, but also to look at the future and look at continual improvement. The other element of the standard which is a feature of all these types of standards is looking at if problems occur, if mistakes occur or complaints occur or something goes wrong, then we need to document those things as non-conformities or incidents or whatever we're going to call them, and deal with them in a professional way. So we need to not just hide them under the carpet, but we need to deal with issues as they arise in a professional and open way, and also to look to stop them from occurring again, which would be in ISO terms called corrective action. It also talks about risk assessment, looking at risks and opportunities for improvement, and then looking at how we can improve the organisation over time, and covers things like internal audits to make sure that the processes are in place, and also seek areas for improvement. So there are things that lay on top of this as well, which we'll discuss a bit later. So I hope that gives you a picture of the elements we're talking about when we start to look at the actual requirements of 15189 and 22870 in the next session. Okay, let's start by having a look at the, if you like, structure of 15189 overlaid on the principles we talked about in the previous session. So you can see that the core business processes, if you like, are illustrated in blue down the centre. The management aspects in green at the top left. The support functions in yellow at the bottom that feed into the processes. And the top right in blue, lighter blue, I put here some of the sort of quality aspects, for example, non-conformance handling, continual improvement, aspects like that. And we'll be looking at this in sequence as we go through. So firstly, we're going to start with the first element. I'm obviously not going to go through every single detail as required by the standard. We'll look at a brief overview of the thing. So to start with, the first section talks about organisation and management responsibility. So this clause starts off by talking about a legal entity, the fact that the organisation has to be a legal entity that has to be responsible for its actions and could be sued if necessary, hopefully not. Also it talks about ethical conduct, about responsibility of the laboratory director, or howsoever named, and the quality manager, or the quality role for quality representative. It also talks about management commitment, communication, identifying needs of the user, and also about the quality policy and specific objectives, which you might call KPIs. So it's quite a broad clause, that one. Next clause talks about the management review, which is basically that at intervals, the manager will be expected to review the operation of the management system. And normally this takes the form of a meeting of some kind where we do a kind of health check on the management system. So that meeting we consider things like complaints, corrective actions, results of internal or external audits, QC schemes, EQA or external quality assurance schemes, and look at the results we're getting to make sure that the system's working properly. And there's quite a long list of agenda items contained within the standard. As I say, normally this is a meeting. It may be conducted annually or 6 monthly or possibly 3 months. Obviously not every week, but we need to cover all those requirements over a period. And from that meeting or event, we would have to identify what actions we're going to take and set some timescales to put them in motion. So that will be a kind of executive review of the operation of the management system. Next clause I'm going to talk about is the system itself. So this clause talks about the documentation side of things, really, that you need to have some kind of quality manual and procedures and instructions of how to do stuff. So this is where a lot of the clauses in the standard require we have procedures of how we do things, and this kind of binds all that together. So that's the quality management system. Now I'm going to start talking about the core business process activities here. So the first one on our list here is service agreement. So this would be, in a clinical sense, normally a service level agreement or an overarching contract that says what the laboratory seeks to offer as an organisation, to define that in some kind of document or whatever. It also talks about advisory services here. I've put this close to the customer again because the advisory service may well give customer feedback or engage the customer in a way in terms of determining the services to be offered and advisory services, things like that. Next clause 5.4 talks about the pre-examination process. This would be either self-collection or collection of the samples, or perhaps swabbing or say phlebotomy prior to the analysis. So that's quite a lot of material in there about how we might do that, patient access, this kind of thing, and how the process is adopted. That leads us on to the examination processes, which would start off by the receipt of the sample for analysis, preparation, performance analysis, all the way through to reporting the results. If we outsource work to another laboratory, so if we can't do the work ourselves, you can go to an external or referral laboratory, and this clause talks about that. Essentially, if you do outsource work to another laboratory, they would have to comply with the requirements of 15189, preferably be accredited. Otherwise, you'd have to go and audit them to check they did comply. The next clause talks about ensuring the quality of the results, or quality control, I normally call that. So this will be running reference materials or spike samples or some kind of control sample to ensure that the methods continue to perform over time. At the end of that, we've got post-examination processes, which is to review the results and then reporting of the results, and then eventually that's then released to the client. So how we do that, and that would include making sure the right results get to the user at the end. So that's the core business processes. I've scooped over a lot of that, and I've listed out things like validation and things, but obviously we need to make sure the methods we use are fit for purpose and are reliable over time. That's the core part of it. Below that, we've got the support processes. So I'm going to start with personnel. So we talked earlier about the need to make sure we've got people who are trained and competent to do the work. It also talks about accommodation and environmental conditions. So that will be accommodation wherever, from sample collection all the way through to the lab itself. Also, accommodation is applied to storage areas, decontamination of items if you're doing maintenance or calibration. So any area where it could affect the results, and also access and security is covered in this part. The next clause, 4.6, talks about effectively purchasing. So if we're buying in, consumables or services or test equipment, or say services like maintenance or calibration, we need to make sure they're properly controlled, and that would normally entail having an approved supplier list and a purchasing process and verification of the goods to make sure we receive what we ordered. The next clause, 5.3, talks about laboratory equipment, reagents, consumables. So that will be about making sure that the equipment we use is fit for purpose, and it's maintained and calibrated, and our reagents are stored properly and handled properly, and test kits and things like that are looked after. 5.10 talks about the laboratory information management system. This is essentially IT, to make sure the IT systems we use are available to people, that they work properly, that they're validated. If they're changed, we look at revalidation and make sure the data, as I say, is secure and disposed of in a secure way and retained as necessary so we don't lose it. And two last clauses here. One's called document control, which is clause 4.3. This is essentially to make sure that the documents we use, whether they're our own procedures or perhaps instructions from manufacturers, or perhaps standards or government requirements that apply to quality, are properly controlled. In other words, they're up to date and they're made available to people. And if they get superseded, then we notify people of the change and don't inadvertently use old documents. On the other hand, we've got a clause on records, which is keeping the records to demonstrate that we've done the right thing. And that's not just the technical records, the lab records, but also it's records of things like training, management reviews and internal audits and these kind of aspects. I'm now going to cover the top right hand corner of our graphic, which is some of the things that quality aspects, if you like, which we need to consider. As I mentioned earlier, if some sort of incident occurs, some mistake or some error, transcription error, identification error, something like that could affect the quality of the results or the operation of the system, then we need to document that. And the standard requires that we have a system where we make sure that we can capture that information and we're open about it. As I said before, not to hide stuff under the carpet. We need to make sure that we deal with these issues, and that could be quite a simple thing, or it could involve something more radical that we have to retest the sample, notify the patient or the customer, whatever's necessary. And you need to have some sort of documented trail about what you've done to deal with those situations. So mistakes happen and we accept that, but we need to make sure we're professional about how we handle those. And that's dealt with in this clause about control of non-conformities. In addition, we need to have some system for periodically evaluating the system. It's quite a large clause. This talks about reviewing things like requests and the sample volumes, for example, to make sure that they're appropriate and continue to be so. Also talks here about user feedback and staff suggestions, as well as performing internal audits to make sure the system is implemented, it complies with the requirements, and also look for improvements. It talks about risks as well, identifying risks and mitigation, and quality indicators. Now, I mentioned before about KPIs, key performance indicators, so the standard talks a little about that as well, and about how we use those in terms of improvement. And finally, it talks about if you have an external audit from perhaps UCAS or some other body, then we need some system for capturing the audit findings and then making sure they're appropriately dealt with. So that's clause 4.14. The next clause I'm going to cover is complaints. Obviously, if there's some kind of complaint about the way the laboratory operates, we need to have some kind of feedback system that captures the complaint and deals with it and makes sure the complaint gets dealt with and closed out appropriately. So there has to be a process for that. Now, all of these things may well lead to some kind of corrective action. Now, the idea with ISO is the corrective action, we'd capture the issue, whether it's a complaint or whether it's a non-conformance or an audit finding, and then we try and identify what's the root cause, why did it occur, and then take action to stop it from occurring in the future. So that's quite a powerful thing to look at. How do we stop mistakes from occurring in the future such that we improve the operation? Finally, in terms of these sort of actions, there's another clause called preventive action, which is similar to corrective action, except the starting point is the problem hasn't occurred yet. So this would be trying to identify potential non-conformities or problems before they occur and take action to stop them occurring in the future. So that's like more of a crystal ball thing. So we might be looking at perhaps risks or perhaps adverse trends to see if we can nip something in the bud before it becomes a problem that requires corrective action. And the last clause is continual improvement. So all of this we've been talking about just now all feeds into this continual improvement idea that we want to try and capture issues and opportunities for improvement over the future based upon things like KPIs, key performance indicators, or previous mistakes or audit findings or anything we can capture to be able to improve the organisation. And that then feeds back into the management review process to continue to improve the organisation. So that's a very, very quick oversight of the content of 15189. And I have scooted through that very fast, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the kind of building blocks we're talking about. And those are the things we have to have in place to be able to demonstrate that we're compliant with the standard. In this last section, we're going to talk a little bit about the additional requirements of ISO 22870, which sit on top of 15189 requirements. So you take the baseline of 15189 and add stuff on. And on this graphic, we've shown by outlining in red the clauses which have additional requirements on top of them. So point of care testing is defined in 22870 as testing that is performed near or at the site of a patient with the result leading to possible change in the care of the patient. So this would be something like an antigen kit, which is that the result is performed there and then in the clinic or whatever. So this is where that would apply. Now there are a lot of additional requirements, as you can see, that are amplified. Some of them are more relevant than others. I'll just run through some of the main points which are quite different or quite additional to 15189. First one is in clause 4.1. There's a requirement that we have a health professional grouping or a medical advisory committee that provides clinical oversight in things like the choice of the POC test kits and the methodologies used for sample collection. So that's quite a big thing. That needs to be a multidisciplinary team which looks after the clinical aspects of the processes adopted. Also, that will cover things like selection of the devices, review of quality control and EQA aspects. There's also a requirement that someone looks after someone's appointed, if you like, or has responsibility to look after the sort of oversight of training and development and competency of personnel. That's in addition to the basic 15189 requirements. And then, of course, there's a lot of requirements that sit on top of that, looking at the assessment and the validity of the capability of the test kits which are used, and also looking at ongoing quality control, QC checks, and where available, the participation in some kind of external quality assurance activity, whether that's formal EQA scheme or interlaboratory comparison testing scheme, or perhaps by comparison of the test kit results with perhaps a laboratory, perhaps a PCR laboratory or something like that. So there needs to be some sort of external validation of what the work's being done. And of course, the examination procedure has to be defined, how to collect the samples, how to analyse the data, and how to report it. So that's the additional requirements of 22870. So there's quite a lot inside there too, but as I say, they just add on top of the standard. Okay. Well, as I say, that's been quite a kind of quick run through the standard, but all I wanted to try and do was to give you some kind of idea about what is included and what you need to think about in terms of its kind of scope and activity. The last session, I want to talk a little bit about accreditation. To get more of an in-depth view, you're probably better off going on to your local accreditation body website. In the UK, ours is UCAS. So if you want to look at the UCAS website, the address is there, ucas.com, and they've got a little video that talks about how you might apply for accreditation. But this is similar worldwide. But I just want to say something a little bit more about that in terms of how this accreditation thing operates. Earlier on, we talked about ISO 9001 very briefly, and I think I mentioned that's a very common standard people use. There's over 1 million companies who've got ISO 9001 certification, and that standard can apply to any type of organisation. So we could apply it to a laboratory if we wanted to, but we're probably not going to. So just talk about 9001 to start with. So if you have a company and they want to get ISO 9001 certification, and they want to be approved and recognised to that, then what they do is they apply to what's called a certification body. And we've got a lot of those in the UK. Here's a few of them. There are others available, so I'll be specific, but some of the ones perhaps might be familiar are BSI, British Standards Institute, Lloyd's Register, SGS, there's BVQI, TRADA, lots of different ones available. But let's imagine we went for BSI as a choice. So what would happen is you'd apply for your certification to the certification body. They'd come and audit you. And if you pass that audit, or when you pass that audit, you get to use their logo, in this case, the BSI little logo there. And that says, okay, we've got 9001. The government was a bit worried about this. This really goes back to when we were sort of heading into Europe in 1992, that some certification bodies, not these ones, but some might be more robust than others. So they wanted to give some kind of oversight to that. So they set up an organisation called the NACCB, the National Accreditation Council for Certification Bodies, which I'm proud to say used to be a member of at one time. Our body, that used to look after the assessment of certification bodies. Gave some kind of oversight, if you like, of the operation of certification bodies. That organisation is now gone now. It's now part of UCAS. So one of the roles of UCAS is to accredit certification bodies. So there's a bit of UCAS which goes out and they check to make sure that these people, BSI, Lloyd's, these people of the world are doing their job properly, which I'm sure they do. So then the organisation can then show that they are accredited and use the UCAS logo actually. For laboratory accreditation, which is where I'm going here, it's different. In laboratory accreditation, you would apply directly to UCAS because they conduct performance assessment things. So things like ISO 17025, I mentioned earlier, 15189, 22870, and other things like 17020 for inspection, you would apply directly to UCAS. Standards are different here, but I guess the real big difference is the level of technical assessment. Without being rude to the 9001 fraternity, when the auditors come for 9001, the auditor will know something about the subject they're looking at, but they won't necessarily be technical experts in that subject. But for laboratory accreditation, it's different. So the people who come to the lab, part of the team will include people who are expert in that field. So a microbiology lab would have a microbiologist come to assess them, or a chemist for a chemical lab or whatever. So there's a lot more technical rigour, and they'll ask you to demonstrate how you perform the analysis, how you take the samples, so on and so forth. So there's a lot more technical depth to those kind of assessments. And that's the real difference for me. So there's a lot more technical focus. So you'll end up with a team of people coming in, possibly if you have a wide scope of activity. We of course do look at the management system, perhaps not in perhaps such a way that they might do with 9001. So it's a little bit different. But if you get accredited, or once you get accredited, then you can use the UCAS logo when you've officially got no notification. And this is the particular logo here for clinical laboratories. So that's that medical logo. There's a different one for calibration labs or testing labs. That's how accreditation works. And that's recognised worldwide. So UCAS have an agreement through something called ILAC, where their recognition is recognised in Japan and France and Germany and around the world. Basically, the steps in application are fairly similar to whatever accreditation body you go to. You'd apply, you send a fee off and perhaps your quality documentation with an application form. Then you're normally offered some kind of pre-assessment visit. So if you want to go and do a kind of trial run, if you like, you find out any issues you need to deal with early on. And then the actual assessment, which will be a team of assessors coming in to do, well, it could be one if it's a small lab, or several assessors coming in to do the quality system audits. They'll be looking at your policies, your procedures, your technical methods, your validation, your data. And if they're happy with that, then you get audit accreditation. If there are things wrong, which inevitably there are some, then you get an opportunity to be able to fix those things and take corrective action. You might have to pay for another visit to clear those, but hopefully we get accredited from that. And then there's some sort of surveillance routine. So UCAS would come in, normally it's about 6 months after the first visit, and then every year, 4 years, and then on the 4th year, they do a full reassessment visit. So it's a kind of 4-year cycle. And provided you maintain your systems over that time and you keep paying your bill, then you'd maintain your accreditation. You can add to your scope of accreditation if you want to add more types of tests onto your application or other bits of scope. For example, you could start with 15189 and add 22870, 878 on afterwards if you wanted to, and you can extend the scope. And obviously they come and assess that at the time. So that's the way the accreditation book process works, and from that you get listed on the UCAS website. Just want to say I do hope that this session has been useful to you. I know it's been very sort of high level, and I've skipped through a lot of things which have a lot of detail in them, but I just hope it's going to give you an idea of the sort of overall picture and how these things fit together, and also a little bit about the steps if you want to go forward for accreditation. We obviously offer services in this, so if you want some help in terms of training about the standards or auditing or some specialist areas like measurement uncertainty, then we'd be really pleased to hear from you and provide any assistance we can. So the website's here if you want to contact us, or on the email given on this slide. So I wish you all the very best, and especially with your endeavours for achieving accreditation. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.